Welcome to another House Planning Help Google Plus Hangouts, and today it's on the topic of budgets, which are all important if you're building a house. And quite often people go over. I don't know how often they go under, but we've assembled a panel again, and some have experience who've got some good experience in retrofit and also new build. And I think that's the first thing that we're going to do is just introduce everyone. And we'll start with you, Adam, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about you and your experience.
Okay, well, I was a client on a retrofit and extension of a house to the Passive House certified Passive House standard. So it was quite a groundbreaking project, and it finished in 2011. So it's 3 years ago now. So I'm drawing back on memories from a little way back. Since the project, I've written a book called the Passive House Handbook with the architect who worked on the scheme, who's now my colleague Janet Cotterill, and we've also set up an online store for specialist products that we found very hard to source for the project, and we also do design and build as a house. So.
Thank you, and on to Mike.
Yes, I'm Mike Coe, and I'm the self-builder who produced the autonomous house at Cropthorne in Worcestershire. Again, we moved in a little over 3 years ago, but in terms of it being a self-build and having to finish lots of things off, technically we only finished it a few weeks ago, but we've been living in it for 3 years or so. It's one of the few UK houses with no active heating system at all, designed using PHPP, self-certified Passive House. It easily meets Passive House criteria, but we haven't gone through the certification procedure. And also independent in water and waste disposal, so the only external service connection is mains electricity.
And Philippa.
Hi, I'm Philippa Richard, and I'm an interior designer, and I specialise in small spaces, primarily renovations and remodelling, and looking at things like layouts and storage particularly. My background prior to doing this, though, also was 20 years as an accountant, so I'm kind of looking at things from that angle as well.
Well, setting a budget is something I actually know very little about, so I'm hoping to learn from you lot who have to deal with budgets or have done in the past. So maybe first of all, Adam, what does it allow us to do when we set a budget?
Gosh, that's a good question. Well, I think I think for me a key thing is being clear about what you're trying to achieve and clear about what your total budget is from day one, and being open with your architect and your builder about that. I think in doing that, everyone knows the scope of the project, and I think you have to build into that budget, obviously, costs for professional costs. You need to build in some sort of contingency, and in our project, we stripped back the original building to its core and discovered a lot of additional work that needed to be done that wasn't apparent at the time of the design process. So we did have extra costs. So I think if you're doing a retrofit, you have to allow for a much bigger contingency than a new build.
Did the budget change at all during the process? I suppose that's got to be a key point, that you want to try and keep it the same.
It did, mostly because of additional, repairing the structure and augmenting it, really, to stop it falling down. I think I always make a joke that 2 weeks into the build, I realised we should have actually knocked the house down and started again. But it really didn't deserve to be saved. So there was that, and then there's the usual client things of thinking of additional items, not on the build itself, but while we had a team there were a few other little peripheral things that were not really directly connected with the house, but it was easier to do it while they were there. So we did spend a little bit extra on that, but I would say most of the extra cost was the repair work. The other thing as well is when we originally started the project, the house is going to be smaller, but for various reasons, which I won't go into all the details of, just due to time constraints, the planning process that we went through ended up in us having an additional floor, which added quite a few £1,000s to the bill. Not a huge amount, because the size of the envelope was the same, but we had more staircase, another shower room, and another bedroom to kit out.
And Mike, what was it like for you setting your budget? Was it an easy process?
Well, I think because we were doing. Oh, sorry, Mike. Sorry, interrupting you.
That's all right. No, carry on if you like.
It's not your middle name, is it, Adam? Adam Mike? No? You're just getting in the group.
I'll answer the question as best I can, shall I? It is some time ago now, because the build process took more than 3 years, and we had a long wait to get through planning and then architectural design and other details. I think, in all honesty, I had a slightly naive attitude to the whole budgeting business. I was determined that we were going to build the house we wanted to build and that we were going to do it at a surprisingly low price. As it turned out, we didn't. I knew to an extent how much money I had available, and I had some extra emergency funds available. When we got round to appointing our project manager, Mike Neat of EcoDC, who I can mention because nothing he did was bad, he was most insistent that we should actually get a proper formal quotation from a quantity surveyor. And I was saying, oh, no, it's not 300 quid for that, that's a waste of money. But he kind of continued, he kept up the pressure, and eventually I said, all right, yeah, okay, if that's what you want to do. So although there were many estimates within the quantity surveyor's report, partly due to the unusual nature of the build, when I actually got it, I thought, so it's going to cost that much, is it? Right. And we need this much for contingency. Okay, maybe it is actually a good thing that I knew that. It was still within the budget that I had available, but it was nearer to the maximum limit than I had expected it to be. And I think, as it turned out in practice, the quantity surveyor's report wasn't far off. So we had to make a few modifications towards the end. I mean, it was a little easier being a new build because you don't tend to get these unexpected problems that you do when you're restoring an old house and you take a wall down and discover that there's all sorts of rot behind it. In knowing that the excavations would be fairly straightforward, there weren't too many surprises. So the quantity surveyor's report was reasonably accurate. Having said that, we did actually have to use all of the contingency funding as well. But I'm pleased in retrospect that we did do that, because otherwise I would have been completely in the dark.
And Mike, how do you know that you've got everything in the budget?
Well, a lot of it's a case of being well organised, really. This was more complicated because we had these unorthodox systems. You know, we had a rainwater harvesting system based on old bulk orange juice transport containers. So it's like, well, how are we going to get those? What's it going to cost to transport them? How much work am I going to do? I mean, I did a significant amount of work on the house myself, and I didn't include any of that in the budget. Had I included plumber, electrician, general dog's body, the price would have been higher. But it was really just a question of trying to sit down and work out what things were likely to be included, and also particularly the high cost items of the fact that we had to build a full house basement. We've got a full house basement plant room where all of our autonomous systems live, and things like that added significantly to the cost. So we needed to make sure that we knew about those and that they were included in the overall total.
Philippa, thinking about you from the other side of things, when you're advising clients, what do you tell them about setting a budget?
It's similar to what we've already said in terms of trying to make sure you've got as much in as you can, which can be more complicated than you think, because you tend to forget about some of the little details. I mean, on things, you know, your bigger things like kitchens and bathrooms, people will often forget about the hardware, they'll forget about adhesives, the preparation of the walls. Sometimes builders include some of that in their quotes, sometimes they don't. So very often you have to actually probe a bit more to find out precisely what they've covered and what they haven't. Often their estimates will be for maybe a lower specification product than you might want if you're kind of, you know, envisaging something high end. So those, again, all the estimates that somebody like a QS or a builder would give you for the actual products, it's worth going and actually looking at all of those. But a lot of those things can end up adding up. And I think you need to kind of have a contingency for what if you've got the actual estimate wrong, but also what if you just have forgotten things. And normally, yeah, the first kind of finger in the air figure is going to be too low, I find.
I sometimes wonder as well.
I also try and have things where I'm going to kind of think, okay, if you can't do everything you want, where do we think we could strip this back and bring the costs down? So I normally start off with what the client's wanting, and then I have various ideas in the back of my head around, actually, I think that's going to cost a lot, but I think we could do this instead. So you've got ideas of where you could go.
Is it a good idea almost not to be honest with the person that you were dealing with and just keep money in reserve? Because I suppose if you told an architect, well, look, this is the amount, this is the pot of money that I've got, then perhaps they try and build the biggest house that they could for that money. But if you actually said a smaller figure, is that silly?
Well, I think maybe I'm naive. I think you need to be open with people and say, you know, this is. But you know, you say that includes, you know, I'm including, for example, if you've got to pay for your accommodation while the build's taking place, you know, and if you start to subtract realistic amounts for your contingency for all these other non-build costs, you can, you know, you get down to a core that is the real price. And for me, the thing I think that's important is doing as much design work as possible in as much detail before you get on site. And I think also it's selecting your builder. I'm not really convinced. Certainly, if you're trying to do anything unconventional, if you're just doing a standard, you know, building regs house, it's different. But if you're doing something that's you know, leading edge or bleeding edge, depending on your view, you need to really select your builder early on. And you know, maybe they can also you can actually pay them to maybe do some of the design and to do that to do a really deep costing, you know, because if you get someone to do a costing and it's free, they're going to cut corners because it's time they have to spend doing quite a lot of work which they don't get paid for, that they've got no guarantee of actually earning any money for. So maybe actually if you pay them and then you know, maybe it's duplicating, but if you do use a QS, I think the problem there is if the QS isn't familiar with the territory that you're going into, if it's new territory in building terms, they may not be any more accurate than anybody else. So I think a QS is good as long as that they've got the knowledge of the build area that you're going to say. For example, for me, passive house, you know, the extra costs potentially that are incurred there, potentially being the operative word.
I still don't quite understand how you allocate the money as a whole. If you know what you're building, that's one thing you can say to your QS, you do it a certain way, this is the build we're doing, and they can cost everything up. But when you don't know, well, what do I put into buying my plot of land versus what am I going to build on top of it, or how much goes into the kitchen? Does anyone want to pick up on that?
Depends on what you
if you like.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I mean, my budget worked on the basis that I knew how much I had left over after I'd bought the plot of land, because I think in most people's cases, the plot of land is a key part of the whole project, isn't it? Because it might be that you had a very specific design in mind, but you cannot find a plot that can accommodate it, so you may end up having to modify your plans and adapt to the plot that you've got available to you. So I bought the plot and then worked on the basis of, I bought the plot partly because I knew we could build something that was close to what I actually wanted to do, and one of the key issues was that we could have a lot of south-facing glazing, which you wouldn't want facing the street. So it's partly the orientation of it in my case that was one of the key issues. But having got the site, I then knew how much money I had left for the actual build, and so I went from there. But it would be a different approach if you said, well, this is my budget, that's got to include the plot and the build, because the plot is such a big unknown. Prices vary so widely. Depending on where you are in the country, what the plot's like, what area it's in, all sorts of things. So it's a very difficult one to budget for.
Philippa, what can you do? Let's say you're worried that you're starting to go over budget. Can you pull it back, or does it just get tricky? Do you just have to accept I'm going over this amount?
I think there are things you can do to pull things back. I think it's always worth looking at decisions around, you know, some things need doing, or they're better and cheaper being done whilst you're doing all the main building. Other things, particularly some of the finishes, they could wait. You could live without it for, you know, probably quite a while. And I mean, I've made decisions like that, and sometimes I've ended up thinking I can't find what I want, or the money's running out, so I'm just going to get something cheap. And then 10 years on, I might actually still be living with that compromise because it actually turned out to be fine. But I think that it is worth looking at and thinking, what do you absolutely need as a minimum? and not cutting corners on things that are really going to be difficult or expensive later.
And in terms of the fabric of the building, we always, I think a lot of us favour the energy efficient approach. But Adam, for example, your house is Passive House standard. So was there that scenario that it was always the envelope was the first thing that you had to get sorted?
Yes, it was. And I think because there were particular challenges around it being a retrofit, we were the 3rd certified retrofit in the country. I possibly, we did neglect other things. I didn't focus enough on water and maybe a couple of other things that I would like to have spent more time on. But this is why I think one of the things that I think links back to the budgeting is that clients need to focus on being clients and actually being a good client, an effective client that will deliver your project on budget is quite is a skill in itself. So key to that is timely decision making. It's not changing. There are certain points in the project where you just have to stick with what you've got. You're not going to get absolutely 100% everything that you want in a project. You get close, hopefully, but you won't get everything. And once you've got beyond a certain point, if you start saying, well, let's just do that, I can see a benefit in doing that, then yes, there may be a benefit, but the cost impact and the project impact, the additional delays and I think also psychologically the impact it has on the people doing the work. If they've started down the road of doing something one way and then you're actually undoing what you've already done, or having to stop doing waiting, there's a pause in the project because of a change, that can be a bit demoralizing because there's a certain momentum there, and if you break that, you probably incur a cost without realizing it.
Okay, we're getting towards the end of the Hangout. I don't know whether any of you guys, do you have a question for each other, perhaps about your project or an aspect of the budget?
I have I was actually just going to pick up on what Adam was saying and well, what you said as well, Ben, that getting the fabric right first and then concentrating on the things that are important. Although it wasn't specifically what this Hangout was about, the point is that if you are building to a very high standard of energy efficiency and you go over budget a little bit, then the chances are if you've built a super energy efficient house, you're going to recuperate a lot of cash during the ensuing years when you're living in that house, and you will have significantly lower bills. And my case is possibly extreme because we have no heating system, no mains water supply, and no mains drainage. But I am genuinely more than £3,000 a year better off than I was in the conventional Victorian house that I lived in while we were doing the build. So we've lived here just over 3 years. I'm something like £10,000 better off. Now you have to, in effect, start deducting that from the cost of the build. If you're looking at the realistic price of constructing and then living in a building for a number of years, you've got to say, well, it's not just the purchase cost or the build cost or whatever it is. A building costs you what it costs you to live in while you're living in it, and a lot of people don't even think about those costs, and that's part of the reason that we build such terrible houses in this country in many cases. So if you go over a little bit, or you put the budget in the right places, and if you go over a little bit, just think that if you've got a very low energy house, the savings are significant, and of course they are ongoing for the whole of the time that you're living in that house. So you live in the house for 10 years. In my case, I save £30,000 or more.
And also you have a more comfortable house. There's people forget the value of living in a house that is supremely comfortable. And
yes, it's true. Yes,
quality. There's a value to that. If people are saying, well, that has no value, you don't buy the very cheapest of anything else unless you are actually, you are literally, there's no money in the account, there's no way you're going to be able to fund something. If it's food, most people buy somewhere in the middle, don't they? That they don't always get the economy of every single thing unless they are genuinely in financial distress. And I just think it's the same with a house. A lot of people, I think, build overly big, and if you just trim 10% off your floor area, you can recoup the extra money you need to build to a very high energy standard. I mean, even less than 10%. You just think intelligently about how you use the spaces, and probably Philippa knows a lot more about this than I do. But having spaces that have multiple functions at different times is much better than building a whole separate space that you only use occasionally. And we get a lot of people coming to us who are approaching retirement age, and they're all thinking about having their families to visit at Christmas, and they've got to build a house to cope with that size. And I say, well, actually, in 15 years' time, 20 years' time, you won't want to have your family visiting you en masse, because it'll be too much for you, and that big house will have to be kept clean. So you're going to have to employ someone to keep them clean, unless you stay very, very fit yourselves. And actually, for the money you've saved, you can put your family up in a very nice hotel for the next N Christmases.
That's true. Rather than having 2 or 3 bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms that sit empty for 50 weeks of the year, I find this extraordinary, really. Yes, and I stayed with some posh friends of ours recently who've got an enormous house, and it's very nice. It's not low energy. It's historic, and it's got lots and lots of rooms, but none of the rooms is particularly useful. And when we got back from when we'd been out to a nice pub for dinner, they said, well, we can have after dinner drinks. Oh, well, which room should we go in? Oh, we've got this room, we've got that room, we've got that. I was like, well, what's the point? I mean, we've just got one room that has multiple purposes, and it's very nice and very spacious, and you have your drinks there and everything else, and it works very well.
Mm.
And Philippa, I think you're a fan of Sarah Cisanca, aren't you?
Who's that?
I am, and I totally agree with what Adam and Mike are saying. I mean, we have, big dining kitchen, and it has the dining table, and so it's a case of we all sit in there because that's the place where we can all sit. And the spare bedroom is an office, because for the amount of time it needs to be a spare bedroom, there's no point having an extra one. And we did then, we sort of spent more money on getting the fabric of the house good, getting it comfortable, and getting those spaces working well. And that was a better use of the money than trying to do a big extension or this kind of thing. So I'm definitely in favour of only building what you need and being realistic about what you actually need.
Mm.
I have one final question in terms of responsibility. That a little bit further back, we were saying that if this is the first time that you've attempted a house build or a retrofit, then this is going to be difficult for you. So what elements do you do yourself, and what do you say, well, this expert's going to know what they're talking about?
I think you need to write. I would say to people, they need to write a brief of what they want. Brief the architect, and it needs to be in writing. And there's guidance from the RIBA on how to do an architectural brief, and I think that becomes a core document, because then you can refer back to have I actually got? Am I going off course here? Was my initial brief? It gives you a kind of anchor point in the project. So that's one thing.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things, if you want to be hands-on and you want to actually take part in the build process yourself, just make sure that you do things that you're actually capable of doing. Don't be unrealistic and say, well, I'm going to do all the carpentry and all of it when you're actually not that good at it, because you're going to be working alongside professionals who will actually want to get on and get jobs done. And if you're slowing them up and annoying them with your incompetence, it's not going to be a very happy building site. So if you do have ambitions to do work yourself, be aware of how much you can do, that you can't work as quickly as the professionals, and you must work on things that you're capable of. And I think we got the balance reasonably right on that, but I have heard of people saying they're going to take on too much and they just end up causing the professionals who are working on the site huge problems. So I think you have to be realistic about what you can actually do.
And I would say also you shouldn't do anything that's on the critical path. Do something that if it gets delayed, it's not going to delay the whole project.
Yeah, don't decide that you're going to do the structural engineering calculations unless you really know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Basically, yeah. Unless you're a structural engineer. Yeah.
I suppose that sometimes people are forced into doing certain jobs that perhaps they wouldn't have done because they don't have the money, and then they could dig themselves deeper.
Run out of money and have to take over some of the work. That's the very difficult one. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I think we've had loads of value in this discussion. Thank you very much. Should we conclude, if you've got a final thought, or just plug your own website or whatever you fancy? Adam?
Oh, I was going to say, for me, it was an amazing experience to self-build, and I really think people should. I feel quite a proselytizer about it, because it stimulates innovation in building, and it is a great life experience. I really feel it's a kind of rite of passage, but it is worth thinking about your role as a client and not trying and be the architect and the builder. I mean, notwithstanding doing some tasks yourself, but unless you are genuinely building it yourself, if you're paying someone to do the build, they know how to build. You've got to select someone who you trust, and therefore you're handing control to them to some extent. But you've got a big enough job as a client. That's sticks to being a good client.
And Mike?
Yes, I think that's true to a certain extent. I think being sensible and realistic as a client is a very good thing. Just what I said earlier, really. Spend the money on getting the fabric and the structure right. Really can recommend Passive House highly if you're thinking of self-building. Get those energy requirements down, because it will pay you huge dividends in the long term. I mean, who knows where fuel prices are going to go when the government can no longer hold them down? And it is also, as Adam said, it's a very nice environment to live in. It's very strange how you get used to it, and you go and stay in other buildings for social reasons. Oh, it's odd because it's not a passive house. It's somehow just got that little extra magic.
Mm.
And Philippa?
Yeah, I would like to plug using QSs.
Oh dear, we're losing you a little bit. Do you want to try that one again?
And
Can't hear you.
Okay, I think
Is it her link?
that may have the speed has failed us. Try once more, and if not, I think we're just going to have to round things off there. We're going to have to round things off there. Well, thank you very much, one and all. It's been a brilliant hangout. Appreciate all of your time this evening. And the next one will be looking at uniting a team. So that's what we'll be doing next time on House Planning Help. And Philippa, so that still seems to be coming through.
Still soldiering on.
Good night, Philippa. You'll probably get this in 10 minutes' time when it's downloaded. We need to get you on Fiverr. Thanks a lot, everyone. Cheers.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Nice to speak to you all.